Shalom Ha'ov al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Le'olam. Shalom Ha'ov al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Le'olam. Ki Ator Melech Adon Lechol Hashem. Shalom Ha'ov al Yisrael Amcha Tasim Le'olam. Shalom Ha'ov.
I live nearby and I come down here reasonably regularly. I regard it as a privilege to come down and see one of nature's greatest sights in the middle of a city. Some days, you know, nothing happens, and other days then you don't know where to look because there's so much going on. We do see otters here from time to time as well, and sparrowhawks. There's foxes, there's squirrels. So there's a great variety.
I love the Dodder. I would raid on the Dodder down in Orwell Gardens, you know, and I used to take photographs, but I wouldn't be really serious about it, you know. But when I seen the kingfisher and the foxes and all, I was hooked. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of times in the winter I nearly be down nearly every day because of the fact that there'd be no leaves on the trees and all, you know, and you'd get a good chance of seeing the kingfisher. And of course I love the foxes, you know.
So I set up 2 years ago, and at the moment we've nearly 2,200 members in the group from 10 different countries around the world.
I got the shots I've been after for a year. I'm so happy. I'm just gonna see what the other ones. Ooh! Oh my god. I've been dreaming of this shot for 2 years. Oh, and this is even better. Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god.
Welcome to Jewish Cork. The first two Jews who arrived in Cork were Portuguese cooks from the Duke of Schomberg's army in the late 1600s. There was no real Jewish community at that time until 200 years later. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, millions of Jews left their homes in Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, and in search of new opportunities. Some of them, mostly from Lithuania, found their way to Cork City, landing at Cove. On this walk, we're going to introduce you to some of the history, the poetry, the music and the stories from members of the community then and now.
This is the Trinity Bridge. It's also known as the Passover Bridge. It was erected in 1977 and opened by the first and only Jewish Lord Mayor of Cork, Gerald Goldberg. He was born in 1912, and he was one of 12 children from Lithuanian parents. He qualified in 1937 as a solicitor and practiced for 63 years. He was not only the Lord Mayor of Cork, but he was also the president of the Hebrew congregation. Gerald Goldberg was known to stand up for those who didn't have a voice, and he was also known to speak up when something was wrong.
The mikveh, the Jewish ritual bath, mainly used by women, was in the back of the Turkish baths on the South Mall, where Jacob's on the Mall restaurant now stands. There was a back entrance over there on Father Matthew Quay so that women could enter the mikveh, called the private Jewish bath, without having to go through the public Turkish bath area.
When Jewish families started to migrate to Cork in the late 1800s, the men of the community would meet in someone's living room for services. When the community became big enough, two congregations developed, Cork Hebrew Congregation and Remnant of Israel. By 1911, there were approximately 450 Jews in all of Cork, and in 1915, the two congregations combined into one, the Hebrew Congregation, and settled here at 10 South Terrace. However, after the 1920s, the Cork Jewish community started to dwindle as people left for places such as Dublin, London, Manchester, and Israel. And by February 2016, the synagogue here on South Terrace opened its doors for the last time.
Lecha dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabala. Lecha dodi likrat kala, Penei Shabbat nekabala.
Here in the area behind the synagogue, Kemp Street, there was an old Jewish graveyard from the period before the Cork Hebrew Congregation, probably from the 1700s. We don't know how many people were buried in that cemetery, unfortunately. Later, this area became a bacon curing factory. Later still it was a car park, and now it's being made into a housing estate. The Cork Hebrew Congregation purchased land for burial in the 1880s, and that's a few miles outside the city in a beautiful elevated area in Curragh-Capone. Many well-known and less well-known members of the old community are buried there, as were some Jewish victims of the Lusitania tragedy in 1915. Lahavdil, which means on a completely different subject, on the other side of the housing estate there, on Douglas Street, there's a pub called the Gables, and a klezmer music session took place there every Tuesday evening, back in the day in pre-COVID times, from 2019 until early 2020.
At the sad deconsecration ceremony and closure of the Cork Synagogue in 2016, a small and dedicated group formed the Munster Jewish Community to keep Judaism alive in Cork and surrounding counties. Since its formation, more Jews in Ireland are making contact as they hear about the community, and we currently have members from Australia, America, Argentina, Israel, Iraq, Russia, Poland, Germany, France, Spain and England, who have all chosen to live and work in Cork and the surrounding counties. Although we don't yet have our own synagogue building, just like all diaspora communities, we meet where we can and continue to celebrate major and minor festivals, with rabbis from England and America also occasionally visiting and leading services and discussions.
Mary Elmes was born May 5, 1908 in Ballintemple, Cork. In 1928, she attended Trinity College in Dublin. Then, in the 1930s, she received a scholarship to attend the London School of Economics. By 1935, Mary Elmes received a certificate in international studies before traveling to assist Spanish Civil War refugees. During the 1940s, she was arrested by the Gestapo on suspicion of espionage, but that did not stop her from smuggling Jewish children and adults out of France in the boot of her car to evade Nazi deportation. Mary Elmes was not known to accept medals during her life because it was the right thing to do. Her bravery saved the lives of over 400 children and adults.
This bridge was opened in September 2019 as a pedestrian and cycling bridge honouring Mary Elmes. Among those at the opening were members of Mary Elmes' family, as well as one of the survivors who was rescued aged 4 or 5 by Mary and other volunteers in France in 1942. Also at the opening of the Mary Elmes Bridge were Cork locals, dignitaries and members of the Irish Jewish community. There's so much to tell and so little time, but more information about the Cork Hebrew congregation is on permanent display at Cork Public Museum in Fitzgerald's Park. It's called The Tsars, the Rose Hills and the Music Shop. There are items there from the synagogue and a lot more history than we've shared here. In Cork we have regular klezmer music sessions, and the Munster Jewish community can be contacted through their website. Thanks so much to everyone involved, and also to those not directly involved for their encouragement. Please do get in touch via the webpage. Sei gesund.
Grandma came to Ireland from Lithuania. My Zeta knew some people who moved here many years before their rainy landing at the dock at Queenstown Pier, June the 16th, 1904. My mother can't
I think the first thing that drew me to etching was its capacity for detail. Someone told me that you could achieve a finer line with etching than you ever could with drawing. The first time I tried it was in a family friend's house. She had a printing press in her garage. She had set up a small acid bath in her kitchen for the day and had prepared small plates for us to draw on. I drew a series of small watch and clock faces on the soft ground. Of course, once the image had been etched, inked up and printed, all my clocks were running backwards. I hadn't understood that I was creating a stamp, the mirror image of what I wanted the final image to be. That's an inherent part of the printer's thought process. We're always thinking in mirror image. Preparing a plate feels like something of a ritual. We file the edges of our plates, degrease them, cover them in a waxy ground, and then we draw our image with a scribe, exposing copper lines in the prepared surface. Despite any printer's best effort to control the medium, there are always surprises and unplanned marks. It took me time to learn to embrace them, to work with them, to navigate the process and accept that some days the acid, the aquatint, the wax grounds all seem to have a mind of their own. The technique that I rely on most in my work is aquatint, which creates tone. The longer the plate is exposed to the acid, the more ink it can hold. In etching, we protect the light areas first, before incrementally stopping out areas of each tonal value, working through every density from white to black. So we're not just thinking in mirror image, we're also having to think negative to positive, inverting the image in order to process it. I think because so much of my work uses film and photography as its primary source, I find myself playing with the formal mechanisms of other media and how they relate to print, Negatives, montage, double and overexposure, tracking shots, the relationship between analog and digital, zoom and close-ups, photo collage. They all make their way onto my plates. Aesthetically, the influence of cinema and photography are littered throughout my etchings. The shadows of film noir, the experiments of Man Ray. I love the drama of black and white, the information it gives the viewer and the part it lets you fill in, the nostalgia that comes with it. I think most people looking at my work would think that the architecture was the subject matter, but I've realised it's actually the light, which is as unique to any city as its buildings. I'm catching places at very specific moments in time when the shadows and reflections play with these solid structures, creating an inventory of light and shade.
The city of Vilnius, once known as the Jerusalem of the North, was a thriving center of Jewish life. Of the 240,000 Jews in Lithuania before the Holocaust, less than 200 remain. And I've come here to trace the imprint of that Jewish heritage in the archives and synagogues, in the cemeteries and mass graves, and in people's stories and memories. My journey begins in Panar. This is where 100,000 people, most of them Jews, were murdered. They were marched here on foot or herded into lorries and railway cars, placed in a waiting area, told to undress, their valuables removed, then led, blindfolded, naked, to the edge of the pits where they were shot until they fell in. Those who did not die immediately were buried alive. At the end of a day's shooting, the pits were covered with a layer of sand. Sometimes this task was completed by Jews themselves, who were then murdered by the Lithuanian firing squads. The massacres took place on an almost daily basis between July 1941 and July 1944 and were carried out by the German SS and their Lithuanian riflemen. Yet today, the 30th of August 2008, the scene at Panar is tranquil. A slight breeze fluttering through the trees. There are no birds overhead. Beneath my feet, the earth is soft, almost trembling. The foliage, I notice, has an unusually vibrant hue. I think of all those whose bodies have seeped into this soil and nourished it, and colored this grass such a deep, rich green. Not 100 yards from here, children play with a water hose. A small dog runs across the track. Teenagers gather outside the station. They are oblivious to the horrors that have taken place in their village, unaware of the stain of complicity that has soaked through their country's past.